Paleo Runner Podcast is devoted to finding better ways to live, run, train, and eat. I'm your host, Aaron Olson. You can find more information by going to paleorunner.org. If you enjoy the show, please go to iTunes and leave a review. Search for Paleo Runner in iTunes and click ratings and reviews. You can also follow me on facebook.com/runpaleo or on Twitter @runpaleo. I wanted to take a minute to let you know about a product I've been using called 3Fuel. 3Fuel is a sports drink that gives you fat, protein, and carbohydrates to use as a fuel source. Unlike sugary sports drinks, 3Fuel gets absorbed slowly into your bloodstream to give you sustained energy throughout your workout. If you'd like to give it a try, you can get 10% off by using the coupon code 3FOLSON. Go to paleorunner.org and click 3Fuel at the top of the page. If you're listening through the podcast app on iPhone, click the link displayed on the app right now. If you like podcasts, you're going to like Audible.com. There's over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Lately, I've been listening to Focus by Daniel Goleman. If you're listening on the iPhone or iPad, click the link displayed on the app right now to get your free audiobook download, or go to paleorunner.org and click Audible at the top of the page. My guest today is Dr. Steve Gangemi. Dr. Gangemi helps educate athletes about injury and overtraining. His goal is to help every person live longer and healthier while becoming faster, stronger, and a more efficient athlete. He's competed in 20 Ironman races, as well as countless other triathlons, bicycle races, and running events. Dr. Gangemi, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. Appreciate it.
So, Dr. Gangemi, you have some pretty ambitious goals there on your website. You say that you want to help athletes prevent injury and overtraining while actually getting fitter and becoming faster. So kind of give me the basics overview of how you actually go about doing that. Say an endurance athlete or someone listening to this were to come into your clinic and wanted to learn how they can, train hard, get faster, but also prevent injuries. How would you do that?
Well, sure, that's a good question. Probably several different ways I can answer that. I'd say first, usually when I see someone in my office, they're unfortunately there, 9 out of 10 times, if not a little bit greater than that, because they've actually been injured or they're still dealing with some sort of acute or chronic injury. And unfortunately, they're in my office to to become a more faster or stronger athlete at that time. That's something that they eventually learn once I start working on them. Most athletes, one of the things that prohibits them from getting to their next level, whatever that may be, either to run faster, run longer, or whatever their goal is, typically are limited by an injury. It's a big thing in so many athletes. I don't know the actual rate of injuries today, but you rarely find somebody, or it's pretty difficult to find somebody who isn't dealing with even a nagging injury. Maybe it's a stiff neck, and maybe it's an achy knee if they don't stretch out or warm up properly, or they're dealing with a chronic injury that limits them from running a little bit further or a little bit faster. So it's sort of like their crutch at the time. So athletes, unfortunately, end up overtraining, end up injured, and then they're forced to rest up or spend that rest and recovery time dealing with an injury rather than using it towards efficient and effective recovery from training from their training.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, you mentioned a few things there. You mentioned that we need to warm up properly, and then I think I heard you said stretch out, but I've seen a few things on your site that you're a little bit skeptical of stretching. Tell me a little bit more of your view on stretching, because I think I saw an article that you talked about stretching might actually be dangerous.
Yeah, well, I do have T-shirts that say, only bozos stretch, and it's a picture of a clown, the bozo clown, doing a classic runner's hurdler stretch. The idea here is that most people think that flexibility equates to better performance, and that's a big misconception. Flexibility, first of all, isn't typically gained solely by stretching. Now, yeah, you can stretch out a muscle. You can try and lengthen your hamstrings, or do a quad stretch and lengthen some of these muscles and have a little bit more range of motion. But if you're doing the traditional stretch and hold, what we all know is static stretching, those results are limited to basically the time that you have to keep on putting into that type of stretch. Flexibility is really a reflection of our nervous system. It's a reflection of balance within our nervous system and how our musculoskeletal system interacts with our nervous system. So if there's certain stresses in the nervous system, whether that's hormonal stress, whether it's an injury feeding back into the nervous system, whether it's immune system stress. It can really be anything. Then the muscles will react a certain way and create imbalances, and then that ends up causing the person to be inflexible. So they feel like they need to stretch, and eventually those imbalances of the muscles equate to biomechanical instabilities, and then next thing you know, your knee hurts, your ankle hurts, or shoulder, or whatever you're dealing with. So we always feel like that we need to stretch that out to try and loosen the joint or loosen the area that we're dealing with, and so we're able to train or race. But really, it never corrects the problem. Someone who always has to stretch to exercise, they're always having to stretch. They don't ever correct the problem by doing it that way. There's no way you can actually reduce a muscular tightness by stretching. So we end up, taking a step back and looking at, okay, where did the cause of this symptom, this muscle tightness or this muscle imbalance come from, and how do you correct it? You correct that by perhaps changing your diet or changing your training routine or changing your recovery, whatever that may be. And the thing with stretching is that a lot of the stretching that people are doing is completely, we'll say this way, it's a better way to look at it, is that they're creating a lot of instability in a joint. And when you're doing an isolated stretch and trying to isolate a muscle and increase the range of motion beyond what you're currently capable of, then you lose a lot of stability in the area, and you create a weakness to that joint, and that further is going to lead that person to an injury. And then when they get injured, what do they want to do? They want to stretch it out more. But the thing is, when you're injured, your body actually wants to obviously try and heal that tissue by realigning the muscle fibers. And if you keep on stretching those muscle fibers away from where they're trying to realign themselves, then all you do is delay the injury further and further. So it's a big conundrum there.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard for some of us who aren't elite athletes and don't have trainers. When we see, when I did track and cross country in high school, we always spent like 10 or 20 minutes stretching at the beginning. And then I see elite athletes, even now it seems like they're still doing some of these static stretches. So it's kind of confusing, but I always thought when I was doing those static stretches, what does this have to do with running? It doesn't make any sense. I would think for activity like running, you want your muscles to be kind of springy and tight and, kind of moving almost like a cheetah. But if you're sitting there stretching something out, it almost seems like it would make it more like a wet noodle or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always tell people I'm all for flexibility. I'm all for moving. I'm all for dynamic movings, like, doing what many people know as eccentric loading type, activities, including stretching that way. In other words, like doing a deep squat or doing a box jump down from a box where you're actually, stretching certain muscles as you land and go into a little bit of a squat. I mean, that's a great way to increase joint mobility as well as improve strength and stability. But the thing is, if you just, grab your ankle and try and bring your heel to your butt to stretch out your quad, you're creating a massive amount of instability and stress in the knee. And I always say to people, why do you need to bring your heel to your butt while you run? Just like you said, I mean, what is the point of that? Even if you were going to run hurdles or something like that, and you need a little bit longer stride or jump to get more distance in your legs to perhaps jump further or get over a hurdle or something like that. You still need to work on more dynamic movements and how muscles all relate to one another in dynamic motion, rather than try and isolate these muscles individually, because muscles never work individually. Although you can try and focus on a certain muscle, you're never just using one muscle. So when you isolate a muscle, you end up typically with problems. Okay,
interesting. And you go by the name of Sock Doc, and I think that's because you're really into this sort of barefoot style of running and natural movement. But can you tell me a little bit more about maybe how you got that name and how it relates to how important you think it is to move your feet in a natural way?
Sure. A friend of mine who actually helped me develop the Sock Doc site back in 2011, we were just talking one night, and I told him how I had always run in Nike Frees and Ironman races and sort of lightweight trainers rather than thick conventional type stability shoes, at least in the last 15, 20 years probably now. And then last few years, around that time, 2010 through 2011, I just started going barefoot even in my office, and especially here in the hot North Carolina summers, it cool me off, and I felt better not wearing shoes or even socks. In the winter, I wore socks, so he came up with the name Sock Doc, since I'm a doctor and I was wearing socks in the office. And even though that's kind of where the name came from, it really has to do with, sort of the holistic and minimalistic lifestyle of using what you've got and not needing support like orthotics, and not needing, stability shoes, and strengthening your feet and strengthening your body, and managing yourself in a completely natural way, improving proprioception, which is how your body relates, or how your body knows where it is in relationship to its surroundings, especially your feet with the ground. And your feet have a huge reflection of your overall health, which is why people typically, when they're stressed out and run down, whether that's because of too much training or too much work or too much family stress or whatever, their feet hurt, and it's not necessarily because they're standing on them all day, even if it's a hard surface. It's typically just something that provokes the ache more. But your feet are typically a good reflection of how healthy and how fit you are too. So if your feet hurt at the end of the day, then it's often because your body's trying to deal with more than it can. And shoes tend to alter that proprioception and sort of act as a crutch for what really may be going on in your body that you might not realize if you're always wearing especially supportive footwear. So the more you can go barefoot, I feel the better. I don't think, you always have to go barefoot, but I like to tell people you should be able to, you should be able to walk barefoot, especially at least in your house, and work if you're allowed to. Obviously, some places aren't practical, and you should be able to stand barefoot with no pain, and, your feet should be, strong feet. So you might not want to all the time, but you should be able to. It'll let you know how well you're doing overall.
Interesting. So do you think that wearing a more minimal type shoe is going to help people stay injury free? And is that something that you would recommend people wear, all the time? Or is it just a tool that they can use?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, I think ideally the goal is to wear as little as possible, as much as you possibly can. People like to say that, you can't wear certain shoes in certain environments, and of course that's true. I mean, if you're in a dangerous environment like a construction zone, you're probably not going to want to be wearing shoes that can, something lands on your foot, it's not going to feel too good. But for the most part, if you need footwear that has an arch support in it, or pronation control, or more cushion to help absorb shock in your feet, then you're sort of missing the idea of what's really going on with your foot and your body and your overall health. So, I like to tell people if, you can't run, say, 10 miles without a more supportive shoe, then, you should maybe look at running less until you can wear less footwear, because you're basically using that shoe as a brace to support your body when it's, basically going on beyond its capabilities at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that last part is that, if you can't go more than 10 miles without a shoe, maybe you should listen to your body and go a little bit less. I know when I first started running in the Vibram 5 Fingers, my feet kind of hurt after about 8 miles of running, so I just said to myself, I'm just going to listen to my body and see what happens. And actually, I think that was one of the best things I did, because it actually helped me to train a little bit less, and I found out that I actually didn't need to train as much as I used to think I did.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it.
And that's kind of the next topic I'd like to get into, is this idea of, you say in your bio that you want to help people to prevent overtraining. How can you go about recognizing when you're overtraining?
Well, that's sometimes easier said than done. Unfortunately, as any athlete who's trained hard, I have, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners, you typically know you're overtrained sometimes when it's a little bit too late. After you've been on that endorphin rush for a few weeks and you're feeling great and you feel like nobody can beat you, and then all of a sudden, you end up you wake up one day and your foot hurts, or you're sick or something like that. I have an article somewhere on the ZocDoc site that talks about little signs and symptoms of overtraining. And, one of the things that happens when we overtrain is we produce a lot of hormonal stress. That's a lot of cortisol is secreted by our adrenal glands, our major stress glands that sit on top of our kidneys and help balance out our blood sugar and deal with inflammation, that sort of thing. And then we end up with lower of anabolic type hormones. So for women, that's progesterone, estrogen, and for us guys, it's more testosterone. So things you see when you start to overtrain, you might get symptoms like, you're tired more often. You don't obviously feel like training too much. Your performance isn't what it used to be. You're not improving as you once were. Maybe you're starting to get little aches and pains, and that could even be just you get up in the morning and you're just a little bit more stiff or stiff. You shouldn't be stiff at all. A lot of people are sort of just used to daily nagging symptoms, and a lot of people I'd say a lot of people are always training. They're always sort of pushing that red line of training too hard. But low energy, low libido, sex drive, you just don't feel like participating in those activities. That's a big sign of overtraining. Sleep issues are a huge symptom of training too hard. Either insomnia, when it takes you too long to get to sleep, meaning over like 15, 20 minutes, or especially if you're waking up in the middle of the night, like you just wake up or you're tossing and turning and you can't get back to sleep, or you wake up really hungry in the middle of the night. That's a big sign of overtraining. And then there's even little signs and symptoms that people get, like dizzy when you stand up quick. If you're tying your shoes and you stand up quick, you kind of get lightheaded or a little bit dizzy, or maybe even a little bit of tunnel vision. That's a big sign of your blood pressure dropping from stress to your adrenal glands. Or another good one a lot of people don't know about is if your eyelid ever twitches a lot, or you get a limb jerk while you're sleeping, like your limb twitches, like your arm jumps a little bit. That's a good sign of overtraining. So little things like that.
Interesting.
Good little sort of tidbits to know before you injure yourself in a bad way.
Mm-hmm. So when you were training for Ironman, lately there's been a lot of talk about in the primal community, paleo primal, about how you might be able to get some of the same results by doing less training. I know I had a guy named Ben Greenfield on the show a few weeks ago, and he trains for Ironman only doing about 8 hours a week. And I think he's doing that to kind of prevent overtraining, but also just to get the most from his body in a short amount of time. What's your view on optimizing or training to optimize performance while preventing overtraining?
Sure. I mean, I think in the Ironman community, it used to be, and I'm sure some people still think that more is better. I mean, in my days, my Ironman races when I was really racing a lot back in the early 2000s, and doing a couple of years, sometimes 3. I would peak out at 20, 21 hours a week of training, and that was hard training too, not, recovery training. So it was a lot of training, and, I think probably I overdid it a couple of those years, but I also had some of my best races on those training hours, at least several weeks in there. But you sort of never know until you play around with it. Could I have done better at less training? And eventually, when I did cut my training down over the years to 13, 14, I never went as low as Ben's talking about, at least not consistently. I still raced really well. I think the endurance training can really beat you up. A lot of athletes don't think that, or they don't realize it until it's too late. I mean, even if you're not doing high intensity training, high anaerobic training, and you're just doing aerobic stuff, it can, putting in a lot of hours on the bike or running especially can really take its toll, even if you don't feel like you're pushing it too hard. So you can definitely get more bang for your buck by really being very specific with your training, and especially building a base. And I know Ben's a smart guy, and I don't necessarily disagree with what he said, but I'd also probably add that if you get someone new who doesn't have much of a base, who hasn't been training many years, they're probably not going to get too far just out of 8 hours of training a week if they want to do something like an Ironman race or an ultra. I think that's definitely the way to go if someone has many years of a great aerobic capacity that they've built up, not necessarily by 20 hours a week, but at least more than that. And then once you got it, you can sort of keep it and build off that by a lot less training over the years, especially as you get older. But it's different for everybody, and you're always going to hear that person who did awesome on 8 hours a week and someone who did great on 25 hours a week. Just like you always wonder what that guy ate for breakfast who won the race, and then he changes the next time and says he raced better. Your athletes are always trying to figure out what's better, so we're always changing our minds, right?
Yeah, that's right. So you mentioned there that you when you drop your training more into the 13, 14 hour range, that you kind of try to do more targeted training. So what training did you eliminate to get down to that shorter time frame?
What I did at that time is I wasn't doing like more than one long run a week, or at least, I might do like a 16, 17-mile long run during that period, but instead of doing, say, 2 10-milers during the week and a couple 8-milers, say I was doing more, like 1 8-mile, 1 5, and 1 10 or something like that. It's just cutting it out here and there. Or with my cycling at that time, I would easily log in a couple weeks of 350 miles, which is easily 15 hours on the bike. And, eventually I had cut those down to 200, and, there's 5 hours right there. So a lot of that came off the bike. With running, running is obviously a lot more demanding on your body when you get into Ironman stuff, so it's easy to overtrain quickly with running, but I also think, you've got to put in the time to get a good base in. But I'm not a subscriber to someone training to the point where they're trying to run more than what the race is. Once in terms of running, once you get over a few hours, I really feel that. I think a lot of your other podcast participants or people you've had on have talked about this, where as soon as you start going over 3 hours, especially in running, you really can you're really delaying recovery time or increasing your recovery time. So 3 hours for a lot of people tends to be the the magic number. So people who are going out and doing 4 or 5 hours of running to get a long run in might not be as good as of idea, especially if they're doing it often, than if they did 2 hours on Friday or Saturday and 3 hours on Sunday, sort of broke it up a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I think athletes, we tend to think that we recover faster than what we do. And, a lot of people are just putting in a lot of miles and they feel good the next day. It can wear on you pretty quickly. And next thing you know, you're just not performing as well as you should.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So did you notice that when you went to the shorter training that you had to be up your intensity?
Not necessarily. By the time I started doing that, I had, I was at the point where I was having to increase my intensity, but it was only because my heart rate was, I was becoming so efficient and sort of my aerobic capacity was so high at that time that I was having to run faster or train a little bit harder just to get my heart rate up to the specific training zone at that time. So even though my times were getting faster, my intensity, wasn't proportional, because I was just having to, sort of maintain what I had and build off of that.
Okay.
Once you start getting to a certain point, you don't have to be doing crazy amount of miles to. Let me say it this way: you're not going to keep on improving by putting in a lot of crazy miles. You're going to start improving. You're going to get better by doing more, not necessarily high intensity workouts, but more, maybe tempo runs or more race specific toward types of training.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay.
So, Steve, you're also a chiropractor,
Yep.
and I had a good experience when I had IT band syndrome. I went to a chiropractor, and I had been doing all these stretches and stuff from a physical therapist for months, and it wasn't getting any better. And I went to the chiropractor, and he said, well, it's actually probably your lower back. And he adjusted my sacroiliac joint, and I was able to run like that day, and without any more IT band pain, which if you haven't had that, it can be pretty painful. And tell me a little bit about how you can use chiropractic to help runners or help endurance athletes who are injured.
Sure. Well, most chiropractors, the way we're trained is by adjusting bones and how they affect the nervous system and how they affect muscles. My practice is actually a little bit different. I don't really do much adjusting. I more treat the muscular, the muscles, and I look at muscle imbalances and how they're related back into the nervous system, rather than the traditional chiropractic view on the nervous system affecting the spine, and then by adjusting the spine, you in turn treat the nervous system, which can treat other areas of the body, from your digestive system to muscles to your immune system and everything else. So it's typically muscles that change the structure of our biomechanics. When we have muscle imbalances from too much stress to our nervous system, so either you're training too hard, perhaps you're not sleeping well or eating well, or if you get injured, say you just trip or sprain your ankle one day by, landing bad while you're running, then you end up with muscle imbalances, and then those muscle imbalances need to be addressed locally through things like trigger point therapy. Sometimes acupressure points help, certain nutritional therapies, dietary interventions, and even specific rehabilitation exercises will help heal up those areas specifically. But also, as someone develops muscle imbalances, especially through compensations, then that in turn feeds back into the nervous system and can create other imbalances elsewhere. So that's why someone might have a foot problem and then all of a sudden develop a hip problem and then have a shoulder problem one day. But you can either go further and talk about how the nervous system, since your nervous system integrates everything in your body, and your muscles are a great reflection of your nervous system, like we talked earlier about with stretching. If you have too much hormonal stress, if your body has nutritional imbalances, or just any imbalance in your body, whether that's a dietary imbalance or too much emotional stress or whatever it may be, then that's enough to, or when it is enough to stress your nervous system out, it will manifest itself with muscle imbalances. So next thing you know, I sort of tell people you're sort of maybe zigging more than you're zagging. Your gait is off. So now you might get a little twist in your body or a little bit of torque where it wasn't before, and you get a little bit of biomechanical instability from these muscle imbalances, from the health problem, from the stress to your nervous system, and now you end up with an injury. So now you have to, like I just mentioned, you have to deal with that injury at the source to help heal it, help reduce the inflammation and heal up the injury at the local area. But also you have to realize where that injury is coming from and resolve why it's there, whether that is person's training too hard, maybe wearing the wrong type of footwear, not sleeping well, or whatever it may be. So you figure out why the nervous system is balanced, and then the muscle imbalances are corrected to help heal up the injury and prevent a further injury from occurring.
Interesting. Okay. You mentioned there that there's a lot going on with the nervous system, and at the beginning you actually said that diet might have something to do with preventing injuries. And this paleo diet has gotten pretty big in the past few years. What are your thoughts on the paleo diet?
Paleo diet, I think, is one of the, or let me say the best. I would say it's the best if I had to pick one, a foundation diet for someone to use and then tweak according to their own biochemistry, their metabolism, from there. So in other words, it's a good foundation for someone to start with and then figure out what works for them. So I'm not a fan of someone being told, use this diet and, only try this diet. This is the only diet that's going to work, because everybody does it different on different diets. I kind of jokingly pick on vegans on my site because I don't usually see vegans to do very well. I actually have never seen a vegan to do very well, and I hope you don't get vegans yelling at you on my site for saying that. But it's just a fact. That's just what I've seen. I typically see people do better when they consume protein, at least egg and whey protein, if they don't want to consume meat. But I'm a big fan of arachidonic acid type fats. I think they're way overlooked, and those are the fats that are found most plentiful in our brains, actually, along with what's called DHA, which stands for docahexanoic acid, which is a long chain fat we commonly know as part of fish oil, EPA and DHA. But arachidonic acid is big time in egg yolks. It's in grass-fed beef. It's in dairy products, especially creams and butters. The fatty part of these animal products coming from an animal, and they're super important for healing. They're important for your nervous system. They're important for your immune system. And I think they're overlooked in how well they can help a person overall, their health and their fitness. And the paleo diet can provide a lot of that, but the paleo diet in its strictest sense is dairy free, obviously. So that's where I kind of, unless someone has a dairy allergy, usually it's not butter though, usually it's casein, like, the protein in major protein in milk.
Right.
I'm a big fan of my patients and people I work with to consume I call it a paleo type diet, and adding in heavy cream, adding in butter and salt, and which isn't part of the paleo diet. And I also think things in the paleo diet maybe shouldn't be in there like they are today, because it's hard to go get really clean fish today. You know, if we lived way back then, you could go to a stream and pull a fish out. You didn't have to worry about it being loaded with mercury from the coal plants or, you know, PCBs from whatever was dumped into the ocean or, you know, and all the stuff that we're dealing with today. And, you know, so if you're a fish eater, and which is, you know, definitely a good thing to do, but, you know, you shouldn't be eating fish too often. You typically got to stay with the smaller fish and stay away from farm-raised fish. And, you know, so you got to kind of tweak the paleo diet out and make it work for how we live today, but also how it works for you. So
can you give me a little bit of an idea of what you ate today?
Sure. Typically for breakfast, I either have a lot of bacon, meaning like 5, 6, 7 strips of bacon, and then I get my eggs right from my front yard where I have 18 hens.
Oh, wow.
So they're pretty local. They get much more local. And then sometimes I make a smoothie with some undenatured whey protein in my Vitamix, and I'll throw some green stuff in there like kale or Swiss or chard or whatever, and some fruit with the whey protein and a lot of coconut milk. And then for lunch, I usually hit Whole Foods and I get a salad with some eggs or some meat, as long as they didn't put too much junk in it there. You know, they like to do that now at Whole Foods. They like to season it up with some crazy things I don't think they should be using. And then dinner, it's pretty much similar, and you know, I base my diet off a lot about how hard I train during the day, or you know, some days I don't have time to train, and therefore I eat less carbohydrates, or maybe I'm only eating fruit that day for carbs, or you know, I like dark chocolate. I might just have a little bit of dark chocolate. But on days when I'm training hard, especially if it's a weekend or during the week, and I've got you know a 3-hour run, and you know, I try not to eat during that run just to utilize fat metabolism, but I might have, you know, some potatoes or some sweet potatoes or some rice that night, you know, just to get some carbs in me, or some more fruit. So I always adjust my carbs based off how long I'm training, duration, especially if I'm getting over an hour or if I'm doing some high intensity training. But otherwise, I try and keep the fat intake, you know, well over, I'm sure it's at least 60% of my diet. You know, so.
And you mentioned carbs there, and you kind of moderate carbs depending on how you're training. Do you take in those carbs before your run, or like the night before a long run, or the day, like right after your long run?
Yeah, it's usually after. I mean, you know, if I know I'm going to do a 3-hour run, say on Saturday, I mean, I'm not going to go carb free all day on Friday, but, you know, I might just eat a little, you know, a couple pieces of fruit, or I'm never really going heavy carbs anyway. I don't eat pasta like I used to. I mean, I used to eat pasta even 10 years ago when I was doing a lot of Ironman stuff. I mean, pasta would be a staple in my diet, or pizza, you know. I mean, easily a few nights a week, and geez, I can't remember the last time I had pasta. You know, but I might, especially after that long run, I might do some, you know, fluid replacement stuff, or, you know, just have some more fruit or bigger chunk of chocolate or something like that. You know, it really depends on how hard I kind of just know how I feel and how much extra carbs that I need. And if I wake, you know, I know when I screwed it up, and which we all do, and, you know, I don't have it perfected. It always changes. Is, you know, if I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm not sleeping well, then I know I probably should have eaten a little bit more carbs, or I make sure I do the next day if I haven't replenished those levels yet, or, you know, depending on how hard and how long I trained. I mean, ideally, I always tell people to utilize, you know, fat while you're training. You should, you know, even up to a 3-hour run, you should be able to run with that, with no food and, you know, only water, unless it's, you know, or maybe even no water unless it's really hot out. You know, but you shouldn't need a gel pack. You shouldn't need any carbohydrate drink up to that period of time if you're very good, if you have a really good aerobic endurance and you're burning primarily fat. So, you know,
so it sounds like you've made a switch to a higher fat diet because you said you used to eat a lot of pasta. Have you found some benefits to doing that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, you know, I would have, you know, even say 5-6 years ago, I mean, I didn't go right to the high fat that I am now. I kind of had like this period where I increased it a lot more, but it wasn't even to the point where I was now, even more, I guess you could call more paleo. But, you know, I would run, say, we have a 14-mile race around here on the trails, and, you know, it takes me around an hour and 45 minutes or so, and I would usually hit a gel pack like right around an hour and 15 in there, you know, just to give me a little bit extra go. And, you know, now I can do that race. I've done it the past couple of years without any gel pack. You know, I'm not bonking, or I'm not feeling like my energy's dropping or anything like that. And probably in the past, or I'd say, you know, in the past I could go 2 hours, a good aerobic run, you know, a good aerobic heart rate pace run, and now I can easily go 3, and I've I've even gotten lost in the woods once where I had to go over 3 without a carb. So, I mean, I've really improved that much more. So,
no, it's great because, I mean, you don't have to carry as much stuff then as well.
Yeah, and then that's the one thing, I changed in my practice where I used to be a big proponent of having people eat. You've probably heard the term like grazers, people who eat frequently throughout the day, you're always snacking on something, like you don't eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but you're eating like every 2 to 3 hours. And I used to be that person. I mean, I remember being in Hawaii before Ironman, and I was like just eating like all day long, like up to the week before the race. And it's because I was eating mostly carbohydrates. And the thing is, when you eat that way, you never really correct the problem. You sort of create habitually imbalanced blood sugar levels. You'll never hear somebody who eats frequently throughout the day all of a sudden say, hey, yeah, I finally fixed my problem. I don't have to eat all day long. It's like it's such a pain in the butt too when you're always having to consume food and your energy drops after a couple hours. You get lightheaded or blood sugar swings. You sort of get headaches or irritable or something like that. And when you really eat a lot of fat, like if you have a bunch of bacon or a bunch of coconut milk, egg yolks, all this stuff for breakfast, I mean, you can go 5-6 hours easy without eating. I mean, when I used to eat mostly carbs for breakfast, rice milk instead of coconut milk, and I used to put honey in my smoothie, which I don't anymore, and maybe have pancakes, even though they were more grain, not like Bisquick pancakes, but pretty healthy pancakes. I could only I'd be treating patients, and 3 hours after breakfast I'd be like, I gotta stop and eat and grab something quick. And I mean, I can go so much longer now, and then when I do need to eat, I'm more hungry rather than suffering from like an energy drop or something like that. So if you want to fix which I term, and some people use the term dysglycemia, which is unstable blood sugar levels rather than hypoglycemia, because your blood sugar levels aren't necessarily low at the time, but if your blood sugars are always swinging all over the place, so we term that dysglycemia, DYS, then the best way to correct that is to eat a lot of fat and a lot of protein, and you should be able to go 4, 5, 6 hours and pretty much eat 3 meals a day, probably 4 if you're training hard on certain days, and you'll see great changes in your health and your fitness, and you'll lean up too. If you're trying to just get a little bit leaner, even if you're not, you'll see you might see, hey, I'm seeing that muscle fiber that I didn't see before. I can see an extra abdominal muscle that you maybe were always trying to lose because your body is burning fat so much more efficiently.
Well, Dr. Gangemi, it's been great having you on the show and hearing more about how to stay injury-free and optimize our performance. Where do you recommend people go to find out more about you?
They can check out sockdoc.com, and that's sock-doc.com.
Great. Well, thanks again for taking the time to talk with me. It was great speaking with you.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to another episode of Paleo Runner Podcast. For more information, go to paleorunner.org. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can help out by transcribing one of the episodes. Feel free to send me an email to aaron@paleorunner.org. That's Aaron, Aaron, @paleorunner.org.